My name is Kacie Athey, and I am a specialty crops entomologist at U of I. And so I work primarily with basically everything that is not corn and soybeans that is grown in the state. So pumpkins, apples, peaches, all kinds of stuff. And right now I'm working primarily in high tunnel production. So I work with peppers and tomatoes and strawberries and all kinds of things. And so today I just kind of wanted to talk to you about biological control, which is what I'm working with right now. And again, I'm working on that primarily in high tunnels. This is a picture of one of those with our tomatoes growing. And high tunnels are kind of, if you're not aware of what high tunnels are, they're kind of like greenhouses, except they're more open. So in a greenhouse system, if I release a bug in there to eat the other bugs, it really can't get out. So we know biological control works pretty well in greenhouses. In a high tunnel, as you can see on the right side, if I release a bunch of bugs in there, there's nothing stopping them from just leaving the high tunnel. And so I kind of want to start just generally with what biological control is and what it is supposed to do. So it's a prevention, reduction, or a delay in pest population. It's important to note that often when we're doing biological control, and really IPM as a discipline, we're not trying to make sure every single pest in the field is eradicated. We are trying to control them to a level that keeps them below doing any kind of injury to your crops. And so in this talk, I will probably switch between saying things like natural enemies or predators. What I mean by natural enemies are predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. So a predator that is pretty common in agricultural fields is something like ladybugs. You see ladybugs all the time. They're a fantastic aphid predator, and we often use those for biological control. Over here, I have a picture of a parasitoid. It's a little wasp. They lay their eggs in other things. Often eggs of other things, or like caterpillars, that sort of thing. And then we also have pathogens, which pathogens and nematodes, which we can release to also attack insects. But what my research primarily is on the predator side of things. And so that's really what I'll be talking about, but just keep in mind all these other things exist as well. And then something else that is a distinction that we think about with biological control is sort of these types of biological control. I want to note that the research I actually do sits pretty much down here in this augmentative biological control world, which I'll talk about, but I do want to note what the other things are. So the first one is this importation biological control. And this is sort of, if you've ever heard of scientists going to another place and trying to find a bug that eats something that has invaded. So like with emerald ash borer, if that's a thing you guys have heard of, it's a relatively new invasive that attacks ash trees and has pretty much destroyed the ash population in the eastern United States. Scientists went over to where it originated and looked for parasitoids that would attack it, in the hopes they could bring the parasitoid back here to attack it, because it had no enemies here. It had nothing that ate it, essentially. And so what we do when we do this is that we go over to wherever this native range of a thing that has just invaded is. So in this infographic, unfortunately, the invasive is actually a plant here. And so just keep that in mind. So in this case, the plant has invaded, let's say it's invaded Illinois, and so we go back to, let's say it came from China. So we go to China and we look and we find these beetles that eat the plant. And so we bring them back over and we put them in quarantine. And then we do all this testing to make sure that they really only eat that plant. Like they would die before they'd eat another plant, is the idea. Then we come back over, once we've determined it won't eat anything else, then we come over and we introduce it into fields, and we just introduce it in giant numbers. And the goal is that it establishes and it just starts eating that plant a whole bunch, and then it spreads to more plants, and it's there, and its impact is that all of a sudden this plant isn't a pest anymore, because this predator of their herbivore takes care of the problem. So that's the goal and sort of the perfect idea of this kind of biological control. Of course, you can probably think of, if you've ever heard of cane toads, which were introduced to take care of a different problem, which became a bigger problem. Asian multicolored lady beetle is an example of this was introduced a long time ago and then accidentally introduced later. And that is a lady beetle that eats aphids. It's great, does that, but it also displaces native lady beetles, sours wine, bites people, gets in your house. You know, not a great example of not exactly what this is supposed to do. But that being said, there are a lot of successes of this kind of biological control. A second kind that I have done a bit of research with, but again is not going to be the focus of what I'm doing at U of I, is this conservation biological control. And this is where people plant like wildflowers on the side of their crops or weed strips and that sort of thing, where they're hoping that natural enemies, things like spiders, little parasitoids, will come in and stay there and then move into the crop and eat all the pests. That's the goal of this. And you do actively have to do something to use this type of biological control. So planting things outside, you know, that sort of thing. And the idea is that you're trying to make homes for natural enemies. Things like parasitoids will come into places like this to get nectar out of these plants. And you hope they'll stay there and then go into your crop and start parasitizing all your aphids, is at least the goal. And yes, I actually already said all of this. And of course, the goal here is to alter the use and timing of pesticides. Really what we want is that we have to spray less. So the idea is these guys are doing our job for us, and we're not having to spray quite as much. Again, that's really the goal of this. And a lot of my research has to do with looking for non-chemical control options for insect pests. But this is what I'm doing this summer. So this is we call augmentative biological control, and this is where we add predators to the environment. So we purchase predators from a company that sells them, and then we throw them into the field, essentially. And this is generally not permanent establishment. Like I said, I work in high tunnels. A lot of people do this in greenhouses. You're not putting something in and hoping that, like with the importation, that you're putting in the environment, it's going to stay there forever. It's going to reproduce and it's going to live there year after year. In this case, this is much more like a spray. You buy the bugs, you throw them in there. You'll probably have to buy more. You'll have to do it again next year. And there's sort of two ways to do this. You can either throw large numbers into predators to really overwhelm the pests, or you can do this sort of inoculative where you're doing small numbers in the early season. And the goal of that is that you want it to sort of eat the pests early on, and so that population never gets high, and maybe those predators establish in your field early on, and you don't have to keep purchasing them. This is more of a reaction to large numbers of pests, and then you just throw sort of as many at it as you can. And as I mentioned before, I say predators, but that also includes those little wasps, the parasitoids. You can purchase lots of those as well. And I'm not going to go through this. I passed out the slides. There is a website through the University of Kentucky that lists just a whole bunch of vendors for this. And they're listed by sort of what pest you have and what predators or parasitoids or pathogens would be useful for that pest. So often a lot of these are much more targeted. So you're going to say, okay, well, I've got an aphid problem, so you're going to purchase something to solve your aphid problem, as opposed to being sort of a broad spectrum answer where you can purchase some predator that will eat kind of everything. That you're generally buying things that are specific to whatever pest issue you have. But there are generalists out there, so specialists are the ones that would be specific, but there are some things that kind of eat everything. And I also added this in here, and I don't necessarily have to go through this, but just that when you're buying these things, much like if you were buying a spray, you really want to talk to the people who are selling these, and you want to understand, like, once you get the bugs, what's the first step? What should you be doing? How is it shipped? You know, that sort of thing, like, so that they are as effective when you get them as possible, so that you're not putting them out when they're likely to die or try to fly away or anything like that. And as I said, sort of the biggest goal is to prevent, to do this early season before your pest numbers are high, and this requires a lot of monitoring of your pests. And the other thing is that biological control is often for things that are regular, predictable pests, things that you're going to see year after year. So like in greenhouses that I'll go through, there's basically 4 groups that are really predictable in greenhouses. You almost always have them. And so when you're trying to control those are good targets for things like biological control. A weird sporadic pest you're not predicting will be there that just shows up maybe isn't going to be a target for biocontrol. And then, of course, much like any other pest scouting, we do monitoring for this. We actually, in our experiment, are using these yellow sticky cards. We're in a high tunnel, so we just put them in. We check them every week. And then we also do visual inspection on plants to look for the pests that are there. And then sometimes you have to do this, more frequently if you're really trying to pinpoint when to release. So, as I said, the experiment that I am doing right now, this summer and next summer, is a collaboration grant with extension agents at Dixon Springs, down in the southern part of the state, and then also at our student sustainability farm in Urbana. And so what we're doing is we're releasing 3 different predators. So we're doing this guy down here, which is, it's called the minute pirate bug. It's supposed to be more general. We're actually doing a species of lady beetle, I'll show that a little later, and some predatory mites to deal with spider mite issues. And the thing is, we don't really know how effective these things are in high tunnels. There's really not much published information about that, and so we don't know that this will be effective. In addition to releasing these things, we're also spraying dipel, or BT sprays, within the tunnels to take care of caterpillars. So our biocontrol agents aren't going to do anything about caterpillars. This year in tomatoes, we've seen a lot of this guy, tomato hornworm, and lots of armyworms. And so we're spraying a BT spray to take care of those as well. So we're not assuming that biological control is the end-all be-all in our experiments, but we're spraying things that won't kill our natural enemies, because the BT only targets caterpillars. And so the pests, the predictable pests that I was talking about, are pictured here. So you've got spider mites, 2-spotted spider mites specifically, aphids, whiteflies right here, and then thrips. And so those are really the groups that we're targeting with this in this experiment. These are really common greenhouse and high tunnel pests, and we think they're good targets for biological control. And that's partially because these groups tend to outbreak if you spray broad spectrums. Because there is a level of biological control already happening with these within any system, and if you spray broad spectrums, you tend to kill all their natural enemies and parasitoids, and sometimes they'll really, really outbreak after a spray. So that's one of the reasons we think biocontrol is a good target, or these are a good target for biocontrol. And so just to go through a little bit, aphids can have up to 30 generations per year, and their life cycle is every 12 days. So you can imagine, and I'm sure anybody who's seen aphids, they're not there one day and all of a sudden they're everywhere. And the aphid damage that you generally see on most things is they do feed on the foliage and you have this distortion of new growth, but you also have that sticky honeydew and the sooty mold that builds up when they're there. And that can cause fruit damage and a variety of other things. And so when you're looking for aphids, you're looking on the back of the leaf, because that's generally where they are, but you're also looking for sort of this sooty mold when you're getting infestations that are pretty high. And then for aphid control, in our experiment, we're using this lady beetle right here, the 2-spot lady beetle. And there's not really much. This is it's really experimental because we don't know if it's going to work. We get it as a little tiny larvae and put it on the plants. This one is also commercially available for aphid control, and then there's some other pictured here, these lacewing larvae and such that you can just buy, and they're recommended for aphid control. And so the general rules with lady beetles are seen here. I will say with ours, these are not necessarily the rules because we do not get them as adults, so we are releasing them during the day. So the results of that experiment are forthcoming to see if putting them on the leaves in the day is useful. And then parasitoids are something that are really common for aphid control. Here's some ones that are commercially available. And I just want to show you this in case you have not seen this. These are mummies. These big bloated brown things are mummies of aphids. That is evidence of parasitism. Those are all parasitoids. So when you have an aphid infestation and you see that, that means your natural enemies are starting to take care of the problem. And sometimes they will do it without any intervention. And so this leaf, of course, had a large aphid infestation, but you can see all the parasitoids, and down here are lady beetle eggs. So that's another example of sort of biocontrol in action, not on purpose. And then mites are kind of our main pest right now this summer. And you can see on the top of a tomato leaf there some damage, cause that sort of stippling damage. They can be really difficult to control. They make these webs, and again, they have really fast generations. And so we have had pretty good success with this guy in some strawberries this year. And then there's a bunch of other things. Mites are generally controlled by other mites, by predatory mites. I just wanted to show you this. This is all mite damage, these brown leaves, all of this. And even though this one doesn't look all that much better, it's much improved. We actually had like these towers of strawberries that were essentially dying. And when we released those mites in large numbers, the strawberry, we had new green leaves, and I'm not actually able to find live spider mites right now in the leaves I'm collecting anymore. And so it seems like at least that predator has been very successful. And then thrips. Thrips, as a note, one thrips is a thrips. It's very weirdly named. There's no thrip. I don't know why. But they do damage to fruit, and they lay their eggs inside of fruit. And again, they transmit viruses. And then we were targeting with this predatory mite and these little bugs. And then whiteflies are another that look a lot, the damage looks a lot like aphids again, but the leaf damage looks like this with this yellowing. Again, they do the sooty mold. Aphids and whiteflies both basically poop sugar, so that's why the mold grows, because there's sugar everywhere. And then whitefly control again, maybe by this predatory mite that we've been using. And then parasitoids as well. So if you have whiteflies and you see these little brown seed-looking things, that's again evidence of parasitoid action. So that was kind of quick. That was a lot of stuff. I don't have any results for you yet because it is ongoing. I'm going to put all the data together and see if we're actually exhibiting any kind of pest control with this summer, and continue on next summer as well. And then that's my contact information, and if anybody has any questions, I would take those now.